We've talked a lot about the pandemic of loneliness here at the Celebrate Kids podcast. And more studies are coming out to show that it's not just kids dealing with loneliness, but adults are too. And some new studies are showing that one of the best ways for adults to curb their feelings of loneliness is to spend time in community, and in some cases, to actually build community, to get married and have kids. This thought pattern is being supported now by some who are saying that having kids brings incredible peace. Now, for those of us who are parents, we might chuckle at that. But in a world filled with loneliness, it might make sense. And it can be an incredibly dark place for our culture and for our friends to be in. But today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, in our daily segment, Facing the Dark, Dr. Kathy is going to unpack this thought pattern and give us some insight on how we can step with more confidence in Christ to have a greater sense of our true identity. So let's turn now to Dr. Kathy Cook.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, Jamie Boulding wrote in The Public Discourse that parenthood is full of surprises, but she's kind of been stuck by how much she's come to understand parenting as fundamentally peaceful. She writes, "Peace is not the first thing that people typically associate with parenting. According to a Pew survey earlier this year, most parents describe parenting as rewarding or enjoyable, but significant numbers also find it tiring and stressful. In many ways, most urgent social and political challenges, declining birth rates and family formation, pervasive feelings of isolation and anxiety, are the inevitable products of a cultural fixation on the costs of parenting. Rather, parenting is peaceful," she writes, "in the deepest meaning of the term, which is when we understand, embrace, love, and find joy in another as a gift," end quote. So, Dr. Kathy, I'll be honest, our house is rarely quiet. We have kids everywhere, and I live here. So it's always boisterous, loud. But I think that many times the world kind of associates peace with stillness or quietness. What do you think is important for parents to remember about peace? And what do you think of Jamie's idea here that parenting is kind of peaceful?
I almost laughed out loud when I read that because I doubt most parents would say that. I appreciate her and I understand what she's saying. And if you define peace as internal joy and peace as contentment because we've done the things we know to do, then I would hope that many parents would have that. And if we don't feel that internal peace and contentment and satisfaction, then let's walk toward someone else, something else. Let's listen to the right podcast, research the topic, ask for a mentor to help us in a particular way. Because I do think it's not stillness and quietness in the house, but it's stillness and quietness in the soul, a confidence that allows us to rest well at night and greet our children in the morning because the day before we did the best we knew how to do to parent the kids that we were given. I think the heart is at peace when we do what we can do.
Yeah, I like that a lot, Dr. Kathy. It reminds me of when I used to work in a dormitory, and oftentimes the kids would struggle with kind of their sense of like peace or their sense of purpose or their sense of identity. And they would just kind of feel sad or down. And I remember one of my mentors would always say, have them go out and serve somebody, have them get an ice cream for somebody, have them do something that reminds them a little bit of the community that's around them. And there's been a lot of research that's been done on this lately about loneliness, the rise of loneliness, the rise of kind of discontent a little bit in culture. And one group actually has kind of encouraged people to look to get married and encouraging churches to be a place where we foster dating and kind of to then bring about kids into the community. And I thought that was an interesting way to kind of approach this pandemic, maybe of loneliness, this pandemic of isolation that we have, to kind of bring about community and actually kind of encourage fostering kids inside of our community. So what would you say to that idea? When we don't have peace, is there something that kind of we should maybe step out into and actually build community and look to maybe kind of like what we talk about here a lot, celebrate kids in a unique way? What do you think that kind of does for a community when we look to make that an endeavor?
It's fascinating to me. One of my first reactions to your question is that I would never want people to have children because they're lonely. The idea that a church becomes a place of intimate fellowship and that dating is encouraged among young adults, I think that's great, because I think it is hard for men and women to find like-minded believers out and about in the culture, especially since so many people are working from home now and may have more of an isolated life. So I don't have a problem with the church engaging in demonstrating that marriage is a healthy thing and something to pursue. I would never want someone to get married because they're lonely. They better get married because they fall in love with the person, not fall in love with love, not fall in love with the activities they do with the person, but to fall in love with the person, and then to choose to have children because God has told them that that would be the right plan for them, to not ever use children as friends. My hope is that parents parent well so that when their children are adults, they want to be friends with their parents. But you don't parent for friendship when they're young. That's not an appropriate use of a child, if I can put it that way. And one more thing about the church that I think is worth thinking about, Wayne, I'm a huge fan of family pastors. So many of our churches, if they're large enough, there's a children's director, a children's ministry pastor, and then there's a youth pastor, and then there's a young adult pastor possibly, and whatever. I'm a huge fan of a family pastor who is in charge, if you will, of content and kind of a scope and sequence of spiritual development from birth to age 18. And then even beyond that, because your parenting doesn't end then, and parents with older kids are really struggling today. So if you're a part of a church that doesn't have a good orientation toward family, maybe we could look at a family pastor who in some churches is the supervisor or boss of the youth pastor and the children's pastor. In some churches, he or she is the person who does it all. And that depends on so many factors. Interesting question.
So Dr. Kathy, I kind of want to go back to Jamie Boulding's article here that talks about having peace, because I think that raising children rarely gives us kind of peace. I think that it almost kind of fosters incredible anxiety or fear. And often parents and adults have a hard time of kind of dealing with it and oftentimes maybe feeling like we might kind of mess things up. So what would you say to the parent who has not experienced the peace maybe that Boulding's talking about? Maybe we would call them kind of the nervous parent. Do they need to kind of change their perspective or approach things differently? Or what would you say to kind of encourage them so maybe they could step into a place where they can really, like we kind of say, celebrate kids?
I appreciate that we're talking about this because I can't imagine what it's like for parents who are living with anxiety and fear 24/7, 365 for years and years and years. That's just sad. So I love that they care deeply. A couple of thoughts come to mind. Are your expectations for yourself and your kids fair and realistic? If you have a special child, the goals have to be different than a child who has no, if you will, special issues. It's not appropriate to have the same expectations for all of your kids because they're all created uniquely, and some will strive and do very well in math and others won't, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that expectations are huge. I would also say that, could we just be honest here and say that every parent will mess up, right? I mean, parenting to avoid messing up is, I guess that's okay, but it's so unrealistic because, especially for your guinea pig kid, I hope your oldest knows, hey, you're the guinea pig, we're trying this out and, no pressure, but all the other kids who follow you are depending upon you, to help this work out. So, what do you do when you do mess up? You admit it, you don't pass blame because you don't want your kids to learn to do that. You apologize. You ask to be forgiven if sin was a part of it. Your vulnerability will actually be a blessing to your children and strengthen your connection. And maybe that honesty allows you to then parent from humility going forward, and you won't be quite as anxious and fearful.
There's something about how Dr. Kathy closed us today that brings me back to the Songs of Ascent. It's a series of psalms that were said oftentimes as people would ascend or go up the path to Jerusalem. There's one specifically that sticks out in my mind as we remember these challenges that many parents are going through. And it comes out of Psalm 121. And this is what the psalmist writes. I lift up my eyes eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon at night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. I think the psalmist writes this knowing that there's unsettling times that many times we encounter and experience. Sometimes those unsettling times happen seemingly because we're following the Lord with fervency and conviction. And in doing that, we can feel oftentimes lonely in cultural moments. But I think what the writer of this article that Dr. Kathy and I referenced today, and also the writer of Psalms understands, is when we live into the place that God has us in these different cultural moments, it is incredibly peaceful. In the middle of a storm, in the middle of many times everything going wrong, we can still have peace in the Lord. And I think remembering that in the middle of a crazy busy week can be a bright light that shines and cuts through the darkest times. So I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this, our daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name's Wayne Stender. I want to say thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.